I kind of changed the subtitle of my talk for today from what the flyer of this conference said. So I'm going to remain with the same question: is anorexia a hunger strike? But the subtitle is Sociological Notes on Recognition of Autonomous Despair, and it's this dialectical tension between autonomy and despair, which I'm interested in relation to thinking the typology of anorexia as a particular form of hunger strike, with a question mark. Is it a particular form of hunger strike? And what is it about the particular despair of anorexics and the particular despair of those who choose hunger strikes as a form of autonomous, a staging of their autonomous despair? What is it that we can study by this typological comparison? So in 1874, some more than 13 decades ago, a British physician by the name of Sir William Gould reported in a meeting held at the Clinical Society of London a new phenomena that he has encountered in his clinic of young women and girls brought to the clinic by their well-to-do upper middle class parents with a strange symptom which he described as losing their appetite. So he describes these young upper middle class women who come, young girls and upper middle class women who come to his clinic and they lost their appetite with no apparent organic cause. Gould published a report on these cases which he suggested calling anorexia nervosa, literally meaning anorexia is a loss of appetite, literally meaning neurotic loss of appetite. In this framing, neurotic loss of appetite, and this is again 1874, in this framing, neurotic loss of appetite, Gould coined a term that has been used for the past 13 decades to describe the objects of medical intervention, those who have passively lost something that has to be regained or restored by means of therapeutic intervention. And that was the whole point of suggesting what the symptoms were all about and what the prognosis and the etiology was all about. So for him and for his colleagues in the many, many decades to follow, anorexia was, or the anorexic body was about a passive loss of appetite. Namely, there was no hunger in it, because if one loses their appetite, obviously they're not hungry. So anorexia was not about hunger, and it was most obviously about a lack of autonomy. And it's for, and in other words, this loss of autonomous capacity with no hunger in it, and it was precisely this loss and lack of subjectivity that made anorexia an object, or anorexic patients an object of therapeutic and clinical interventions. In 1895, that's about some decade and a half following that, the first case of death from starvation was published in a medical journal of the British Medical Association. And you know, by looking at this image, and I'll just go back to the images before, the Miss A, Miss B, and Miss C. So we have on the right-hand side of the slide, it's the before and after for each of these clinical cases. So these are obviously, and even the after ones, they are obviously kind of good-looking and groomed, and their class is very much in this portraits. And this is very different from this image, which lacks the aesthetic and the appeal of the supposedly non-hungry, strangely non-hungry anorexics from before. So far from the aesthetic figure of the young Londoners in upper middle class family, which we have seen before, this image leaves little doubt about the question of whether or not the person who died from starvation was actually hungry. Obviously, she was hungry. It does leave open, though, the image, it does leave open the question of her autonomy. Did she choose to be hungry? And it does leave open the question about the origins and course of the particular despair that her hunger entailed for her before entering the zone of hunger and obviously in its tragic consequences. So this is 1895. A few years later, in the early years of the 20th century, unemployed workers, many of them veterans of the recent war in South Africa, invented the Hunger March to dramatize their plight. I have a bit of a mess here with that. Okay. So, unemployed workers, many of them veterans in the recent war in South Africa, invented the Hunger March to dramatize their plight, marching from London, from towns and cities, from across the Midlands and industrial Northwest. They sought to demonstrate their many strengths and fitness to work, for work, to establish that unemployed were not unemployable, but victimized by the neglect of an unresponsive government, basically. Similarly, just a few years later, in 1909, British suffragists went on hunger strike to protest against their own exclusion from citizenship. And never before used as a vehicle of political process in Britain or in its empire, the hunger strike was a tactic designed to highlight the illegality and violence on which women's political subjection reset, a point driven home by the Liberal government dependence upon. And then there's the whole issue, of course, of force feeding, and this is probably one of the most celebrated kind of famous icons of the force feeding. This is a British suffragist woman from 1911. Oddly, it took me, it's kind of a strange knowledge that I realized that a lot of my writing about hunger and hunger strikes and anorexia kind of all come from and go back to London, because all these occurrences, from Gaull's description to the hunger marches and the suffragists, this all takes place in the same city in London, and there's something about the British political imagination and the British public imagination that really tells us a very interesting story about hunger and the politics of hunger. But I want to emphasize the hunger in hunger strikes. So I think this is a kind of an analytical emphasis that we may want to go back to later in the discussion. Okay, so we were at 1874, 1895, early 20th century with the hunger marches, and then 1909 or 1911, this photo is taken, the suffragists, and we're going to do a fast forward now to 1886. 1986, sorry, to 1986. In 1986, British feminist psychotherapist Susie Orbach, and founder of the Women's Therapy Centre in London, again, published her second book on eating disorders after treating eating disorders patients in the center for some years and working with colleagues on the subject. Her first book, by the way, the title of the first book, which was published in 1978, was Fat is a Feminist Issue, and that was about bulimia and the politics of fatness and overweight, and from a feminist psychotherapist perspective. So that was the first book, and this is the second book. And the title of the book is Hunger Strike, the Anorexic Struggle as a Metaphor of Our Time. And in a nutshell, the core argument of the book is that eating problems express what can't be specified directly in body politics. Eating problems are charged with bearing the burden of political exclusion. They contain within them protest, accommodation, despair, an attempt to engage with as well as attempt to reject exclusion. And then she goes on to say, the therapist, if only the body protest statement could be, read, be it one of fatness or thinness, it would be seen to be one of the few ways that women could express their internal experience. That's the point of hunger strike from Auerbach's point of view. So the point is to say that it is the spectator's gaze that, through the politicization of the silence or the not being able to talk of the women, through the politicization of that silence, gives meaning or politicizes this particular form of despaired autonomy as a protest, as a meaningful way of being active rather than passive in the world. And this is, if we start with Sir William Gould in 1874 with a loss of appetite, that there's no hunger there, and there's a passive loss of something, obviously a lack of autonomy, and we go about 100 years later to Susie Auerbach's complete other side of the moon, that says it is precisely about hunger, and it is precisely about protest, and there is an agency there, there is an autonomy there, there is a choice there, and it's up to the clinicians, and her book is written for clinicians, to recognize the autonomy and the non-passive way of being in the world of anorexics. So it is this autonomy that has to be recognized. And I think that I would like to suggest this term of autonomous despair, because I think it captures something about the paradoxical or the dialectics of passivity and activity, because despair, in therapeutic terms, in philosophical therapeutic terms, despair is a very passive existence. It is a lack of trying. It's when everything is hopeless, and autonomy obviously is the opposite of that. So I think there's something interesting. I would like to suggest that there is something to start a conversation with, a discussion about autonomous despair, which hunger strikers in their various forms are very much lending to this discussion. Thank you.